Here's a question for you. What are the Gospels? If you had asked me this question growing up, I would have told you that the Gospels are different eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, written by people who actually saw and experienced the life of Jesus. As I started to study the Bible and started to study the New Testament, I came to see that not only is that not likely, it's almost impossible given our gospel evidence. And in this video, I want to talk a little more about that. So first of all, my name is Chris. On this channel, I talk a lot about ancient Christianity and a little bit about modern Christianity and deconstructing. And in this video, I want to actually share with you an interview that I did on another channel. So I met a guy named Justin over at Deconstruction Zone, probably about a month ago, I guess, virtually. Justin is just like the coolest, nicest guy, unless you happen to be a Christian calling into his live debate show that he does on both YouTube and TikTok.
Who believe in the religion that is associated with Jesus and the Bible, which means you are hopelessly tied to one of the worst books in history.
I told him the first time I met him, I think I would have an anxiety doing like live debates like that. But anyways, he's fantastic at it and just has an incredible knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and also good knowledge of the New Testament too. So Justin is a super cool guy, definitely worth a follow. So if you haven't yet, Deconstruction Zone is the channel and I will link to it down below. But in this video, I'm going to share a little bit of that interview and then I'm going to do some talking as well. But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit more about this question of what the gospel are. Now, there are a lot of people who have a certain view of the Bible and what the New Testament needs to be. And they are very much wedded to the idea that the Gospels have to be eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And what these people will do, and Christian apologists are a big part of them, is always try to push back the dating of the Gospels, always try to get them as close to the life of Jesus as possible. But what happens when we actually look at the Gospels? We actually see, and we can see, that there are evolving literary traditions in the Gospels. The Gospels have a relationship to each other that I'll talk about in the video in a second. We actually see that the Gospels look a lot less like eyewitness accounts and a lot more like what they are, which is editing, evolving stories about the life of Jesus, each with their own theological focus, each with their own agenda, each with their own idea and understanding of who Jesus was and what the significance of the Jesus movement is. But think about this. In the Synoptic problem, we actually have Matthew and Luke copying directly from Mark. We can see this in the Greek text. There is no debate, there's no discussion. Even conservative scholars agree that the Synoptic problem is the real thing, that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. So if Matthew and Luke are copying extensively from Mark to write their own Gospels, and when we look at the Gospels, we can see layers of multiple texts behind those Gospels, why wouldn't we just assume that through the history of the Gospels, that is literally what is happening, that people were copying and adapting and editing their Gospels? And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit in this video, and then I'll come back to a few wrap-up questions after. So let's go to the video right now. This is me talking about Gospels with Justin from Deconstruction Zone.
The first video I saw that you produced was on the Synoptic problem. And this is a really interesting topic, and a lot of my viewers, and I think a lot of people in general, are curious about the relation of the Gospels. And I think I might kind of understand why that is the case. Because in the circles I run in, the question relies on, are there eyewitnesses? And as far as we can tell, the best eyewitnesses, if there are any, are found in the Gospels. So that seems to be where the most weight is given. But there are some problems calling them eyewitnesses, and who's copying from who, and when were they copying, and different things like that. What's your opinion on the Synoptic problem, Markan priority, and some of these issues? Do you have a solid position?
No, I don't think I actually have a super solid position. I can kind of describe what it is. I mean, essentially, like scholars have known for, I think almost, am I going to say 200 years? Maybe not quite that long, but it's been a long time that scholars have known that the Gospels have a literary relationship to each other, so they copy each other. And then, I mean, a lot of people will ask the natural question, weren't they just eyewitnesses, who are describing the same events and just happen to say the same things? No, they copy each other. So one of the reasons I do this in my videos, I often put the text up in Greek, because even in English, you can kind of make, I don't know, even in English, I think you can see that there's a problem there. But in Greek, you get the Gospels agreeing word for word over sentences and paragraphs, sometimes with very small changes. But you can see without, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they're copying each other. When I was used to TA for undergraduate courses, we would run essays through turnitin.com. And, if you get like I think it was 4 words in a row, it would flag that maybe there's something plagiarism going on here. So if you were to run Matthew and Luke, for example, through with the Gospel of Mark, you'd realize that they share hundreds of verses and hundreds of occasions where there's more than 4 words in a row. So the way that scholars usually reconstruct this, we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and there's not much debate about that. There's pretty commonly accepted that Mark was the first gospel writer. So Mark wrote, people say usually around 70. There's give or take 5 years on either side maybe, but people say around 70. And then both Matthew and Luke copied from Mark and used Mark as a source. There's ongoing questions of whether Matthew and Luke knew each other, which I'll mention in a minute in reference to something else, because I'll try and go slow just to not lose anybody here. So Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source. Now, so that's interesting and it's cool, and you can line up and see how they use Mark, for example. But it's also been recognized for about probably 150 years that Matthew and Luke share a lot of material that's not in Mark. So you have this situation where they have very similar, if not identical material at times. It often corresponds with things that Jesus is saying. So you get the sayings of Jesus that are often identical, and then sometimes the narrative around is framing them a little differently. So what scholars have hypothesized for about 150 years, I think, but it's been really much more developed in the last maybe 50 years, is that there's 50 years. I'm thinking like 1970. Yeah, that's 50 years ago. Maybe
it's hard to believe it was that long ago.
I know. I still think of 1970 as 30 years ago. I'm perpetually stuck in the year 2000. Anyway, so scholars have generally assumed that there's another lost gospel behind Luke and Matthew. This is often called the Q gospel, or the Q source, which is from the German word Quelle, meaning just source. So it's just a source text, unknown source text. Scholars have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to reconstruct it and recreate it and figure out what it might have looked like. And there's a little bit of narrative in it. I think that the temptation of Jesus, parts of it, Mark has a bit of a temptation, but Matthew and Luke have something much more of a temptation story where you get these kind of back and forth with the devil. There's kind of, I think, agreement that was probably also part of Q, but overall a lot of Q is sayings traditions, things Jesus said. So for example, you get material from the Beatitudes that is shared. Matthew has a lot more Beatitudes than Luke has, but they both say, for example, blessed are the poor. Luke says, blessed are the poor, and then Matthew actually says, blessed are the poor in spirit. So that's how you get those kind of slight changes, but we can see when you lay them out, you can see that they're probably sharing a source. So that's the Q hypothesis. It's still, as far as I know, it's still pretty commonly, I think, I don't actually know like if it's still the majority position. There has been a pushback, pushback's not the right word, but there's an alternative explanation that people call the fair hypothesis. That's also quite common. And this is most notably, I think Mark Goodacre is the person who has advanced this in recent years. So in this hypothesis, the idea is that Luke knew Matthew and Mark. So Luke was adopting from Matthew and writing from Matthew, so that it kind of explains why they share material together. So that's essentially the alternative to Q. I'm personally more convinced by Q. I think there probably was a different sayings gospel behind Matthew and Luke. And then this has gotten even more. I mean, just stop me if I'm boring you, because
no, I love it. I'm like forming questions as you're talking.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Well, I want to make sure it's hard to, I sometimes do this with the text in front of me because it's easier to just show, but so essentially potentially lost gospel Q. There's also a lot of really interesting work happening right now around this possibility of a Marcion gospel. So
that was my next question. Keep going.
That was your next question.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So there's a second century guy named Marcion of Synoptic who was later considered a heretic, and he apparently had his own gospel that we just call the Evangelion, which just means gospel. And apparently his gospel was missing the first 2 chapters of Luke. So that's the nativity story. Marcion was, what do we know? So we know that, I think we know that he shared some similarities with what would later be described as Gnostics. So apparently, and we only know about him through the people who didn't like him, so it is hard to know. But apparently he believed that the God of the Jews was kind of a separate and evil God, and that Jesus was sent by a benevolent deity to save us from that evil God. So his movement spread. It became quite popular, I think, for a few centuries, and then was condemned by the emerging proto-Orthodox Church. And then, as is often the case, we only find out about these, I'm putting air quotes here, see if I can get them in the screen, heretics, we only find out about from their detractors. So you get all these stories, like the one is fun that says Marcion seduced a virgin, and that was why one of the reasons why this guy wasn't worth listening to. So there was, do we take that seriously? I don't know. But anyway, so that's Marcion, and he did have a gospel, and apparently it looked kind of similar to the Gospel of Luke. So there's a question as whether Marcion's gospel fits within this triangle, that complicated diagram you already showed that I don't even think had Marcion in it.
It didn't. That's what I want to know, though. Is
so you can probably find one with Marcion in it. I know that the people working on this have a YouTube channel that you can actually check out. But so I think the most common, they've tried to put Marcion in different places. I think right now, the common, let me see, am I going to do this justice? I think the common belief right now is that Marcion may have had, Luke may have had Marcion. So Luke may have been written as a response to Marcion, or it's possible that both Luke and Marcion shared another source behind and between Q and Mark, or with Mark. Anyway, this is where it gets confusing, because, and even Q, like, people have hypothesized like different layers of Q, so it's incredibly complicated when you get into the details of this synoptic problem. So that's hopefully that kind of give you a taste, but let me know if I can clarify. One really big observation about the synoptic problem, and it comes back to the question of were the Gospels eyewitnesses? The thing is, all that we can see in the Gospels are copying. Literally all we can see in the Gospels. So back to this image here, what do we see here? Like, if you these are just the 3 synoptic Gospels, and even from these, if you actually look at what material is unique, you have a very small amount. So if you're going to say Luke and Matthew are eyewitnesses, we know that this purple they took from Mark. We know that this double, I believe they took the double tradition from Q, but at the very least, one of them took from the other one because they share it. So what percentage of this would actually be eyewitness material? Best case scenario, you could argue 35% for Luke and here 20% for Matthew. But the problem is, not only do you have to include those, but as I talked about in the video, you also have to include the fact that, for example, Marcion could have had an impact on Luke or vice versa. When we look at the Gospels, the only observable phenomena, it's hard to say, is copying. It's literally all we have is Gospels copying each other extensively. So if you want to argue these are eyewitness accounts, you're arguing that these are eyewitnesses who maybe took everything that was said before them and added a tiny, tiny little bit of their own material. But that seems really unlikely to me, because what you actually have when you look at the Gospels is you have decades and decades of copying. We have Q, I think hypothetically, I still believe in the Q source. I'll talk more about why in a minute. But let's say we have Q, we have these early sayings collections. These become, these work into Matthew and Luke, and there may have even been multiple layers of Q. We have Mark that Matthew and Luke copy. We have Marcion in there somewhere. We have the Gospel of Thomas that, by the way, also shares some of the material with Q or with Matthew and Luke. So you have these Gospels that are not ever unique. They're literally always sharing material, always copying from each other. So does it make more sense to say these are different eyewitness accounts? Or does it make more sense to say what we are seeing in the act of Gospel writing is a literary tradition of copying, compiling, adapting, editing, and so forth. That's essentially, I think, what we actually have when we look at the Gospels. So there's one kind of final thing I want to just come back to really quick, because this kind of ties in. I talked in another video about the Q hypothesis. You can find it here. I'll put it, make sure I'm pointing on the right side here. So the Q hypothesis. So essentially the Q hypothesis, really, really quick, but you can go watch that video if you want a full rundown. But the Q hypothesis is basically that Matthew and Luke had a shared source that they both copied from. And people have asked me in the comments when I talk about Q, most people are really nice. Some people are even jerks about it and be like, Q is bull crap. I won't swear. Like Q is bull. It's been proven wrong. Like Q is still a really reasonable hypothesis for the shared traditions in Matthew and Luke. In fact, I think it's actually more reasonable than any other hypothesis. And when you look at what happened when scholars a couple hundred years ago came up with the synoptic problem, the most obvious solution was that Matthew and Luke were copying Mark. And the reason they come up with an alternative gospel behind Matthew and Luke's shared tradition, they could have said, hey, look, Matthew's copying Luke, Luke is copying Matthew. And some of them did try to argue that, but it got really complicated. And I'm going to show you just really quick. I want to come back to this graphic I have. When we look at what Matthew and Luke actually share, to me, it's still really difficult to make a case that they are copying each other. So these are the Beatitudes, for example. So this is blessed are the poor. I have the English over here. This is Luke on the right, Matthew on the left, and then the Greek of each text. And then for this video, I highlighted what each one shares. This one has blessed are the poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. Blessed are over here on Luke, blessed are the poor, because to you is the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of God is yours. Now, when you look at this, if you just think for a minute, you're hypothesizing here, form a hypothesis about how these two gospels relate to each other. Well, if I was looking at this problem in particular, I would say Matthew is much better developed. Matthew has beautiful, elegant language here. The Beatitudes are like the most famous verses the world over. They have literally brought people to tears over the centuries. So if you're arguing that Luke is sitting here looking at this text of Matthew and copying it, you have to wonder, why the heck would he leave out these beautiful, like, blessed are the ones who mourn because they will be comforted. Matthew makes the Beatitudes something that are less about poverty and more about sort of moral characters. Maybe his audience was less poor, or maybe his theology is just a little less focused on poor people. But Luke's theology is very poor focused. So Goodacre makes the argument that Luke actually adapts Matthew to be a little more fitting for Luke, the thing Luke really wants to talk about, which is the poor. But you have to wonder, like, why wouldn't Luke include this thing about, like, blessed are those who mourn because they will be comforted, if Luke is sitting here looking at Matthew? Blessed are the ones who show compassion because they will be shown compassion, down here in verse 7. Like, you really have to wonder why on earth Luke would leave out all this wonderful stuff that really does fit with the theology of his whole gospel. And similarly, when I come down here, this was the other... down here was the other text I used about John's disciples coming to ask Jesus, are you the one who's coming, or should we expect another? You have the same thing here. So Luke and Matthew, once again, you see they virtually agree on all the sayings of Jesus. Are you the coming one, or should we expect another? But then they basically write like all of their own framing around. So they keep the sayings of Jesus and they write their own narrative around it. This is why the Q hypothesis was developed, because people looked at this and said, well, if Matthew is copying Luke, maybe in this particular case it might make sense, but why doesn't he keep any of the narrative? Why does he just keep the sayings? And if Luke is copying Matthew, then why does he duplicate here? This is totally unnecessary. He has this thing about John's disciples. John sent them to the Lord saying, are you the coming one, or should we expect another? And then they come to him and the men said, John the Baptizer sent us to you saying, are you the coming one, or should we expect another? So like, if Luke is reading this, why the heck would he add all of this extra material that actually makes the text much more convoluted durably? And by the way, when scholars reconstruct Q, and you can actually go and see a critical edition of Q that's based on the text found in Matthew and Luke, and Thomas in the critical edition. And sure, reconstructing it is a little bit artificial, but when they reconstruct Q, they do find that most of the material is concerned with like agrarian stuff. It sort of makes sense outside of a city, while both Matthew and Luke orient their material towards cities. So when you come to the question of Q, there are some good scholars working on this. And I mean, I think it's still a question worth asking. But that's one reason I have yet to be convinced for any other hypothesis other than Q, because I really have yet to see why Luke would leave out so much good stuff that would fit his narrative. And if we're hypothesizing that Luke is editing Matthew, he edits it differently than he edits Mark. So, I mean, this is ongoing. I'm not going to solve this in this video because if you know anything about this, you know it's complicated. But this is a little bit about why I'm still convinced that Q fits within the story of how the Gospels were compiled and edited and passed on. So here's my takeaway. The Gospels are many wonderful things, but they're not likely eyewitness accounts. They are copies of copies of copies, edits of edits of edits. And if we can see the edits, literally every single gospel we have from this time has some kind of literary relationship to each other. I think I just said that. I'm going to go away and think about it, but I think it's true that almost every first century or second century gospel, well, second century is more complicated, but let's say within like 120 years of Jesus, almost every gospel we can see have some form of literary relationship to each other. So the question is, what is a gospel? The gospel is not at all eyewitnesses. The gospel is a literary almost genre that was copied and edited and adapted and passed forward, and maybe new people took it on and people took their own spin on it. And virtually these are competing stories of Jesus, but they are literary creations. They are not eyewitness accounts. So that's just a few more thoughts about the synoptic problem and a little bit on Q. I've got lots of videos. If you haven't watched my videos about those yet, I'll link to them in the description below so you can learn a little bit more about how the Gospels relate to each other and what they actually are. Do check out that interview with Justin from Deconstruction Zone if you haven't yet. Again, I'll link to that below too. Subscribe to his channel. He's doing some great stuff. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please take a minute and do that. Always appreciate the support. And I'm doing lots of stuff on early Christianity and Christian origins, and I do a little bit on deconstructing and finding faith again. I'd like to dive a little bit more into Christian origins, though, in the coming months. I find I'm getting a little too much towards deconstructing. I'm trying to strike a balance that works for me, but I know the deconstructing stuff means a lot to people too, and it's helpful for me to kind of talk about some of the things I've learned. So take a minute, subscribe if you haven't, check out the interview on Deconstruction Zone. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time.